Thank you, Sanjay. So Sanjay, we are doing a whole bunch of meetups on language from multiple angles. So I want to try to connect, in the honor of Comprehensivist Wednesday. I want to connect up what you're doing with that. So my first question, I'll have like 2 or 3 questions connecting up to various things we are looking at in language. First question was the question from about Steven Pinker. How is it that this one network communicates with another network through a line?
Right. So this idea is very complicated because there's basically everything about humanness that's tied into it. Okay, what it means for us to understand what we're saying. Believe it or not, we don't always understand what we're saying, and what we say, a sentence that we say, oftentimes has more than one meaning, right? And the speaker may have one meaning, or they may have multiple meanings in mind, and they may not realize there's a third or fourth or fifth meaning, right? And the same thing applies to the listener, right? The listener may have one interpretation they take of the sentence, right? That thread, that line, that connecting line. But there may be multiple meanings. Or the listener may take a completely different meaning than what the speaker meant, right? So that's one aspect of intention, and so the transmission and the reception can be, so there's many aspects to that. Another aspect is the familiarity with the ideas that are being presented. Okay, so when the speaker says something, okay, and if the speaker is highly cognizant, highly aware of the topic they're talking about, right, and so they distill this very complicated idea into this sentence, right. Their goal is to make sure that one simplified sentence enters this network of the other person and filters through and takes shape and form similar to how it is in the speaker's mind. Mm-hmm. The reality is that rarely happens, but it does happen roughly most of the time, depending on the similarity of the people, the similarity of their experiences, similarity of their intellectual or emotional levels, educational levels, things like that, similarity of the culture that society that they live in, these aspects. So there's many aspects to humankind that come into play in communication. Communication is very, very complicated. It's one of the most complicated things we do. It's intentional. So another aspect is that if you get into nonverbal aspects of communication, so when the speaker is communicating, their hand, I'm using my hands, right? So their hands may be active. Their facial expressions definitely are, right? To some extent, even pheromones might come out. We don't know. We don't believe. I mean, it's possible. There are many types of information that their neural network, their brain network, is sending out through the muscles. Their cheeks moving, right? Lips obviously moving, tongue, the sounds. Obviously, all of that is controlled. But there are many things, the rate of blinking of their eyes, whether the eye is directly looking at the other person, looking at their face, looking at their nose, looking at far, those things are subtle, but they convey a lot of information. I'm paying attention. I'm not paying attention. You're important. You're not important. These are concepts. These are emotional concepts that can convey separate from that line. So actually, when we're talking about a single line being conveyed, there are actually multiple invisible threads that are running parallel with, and sometimes delayed, right? Delayed in time. And sometimes there may be the predecessor lines that were spoken ahead of time that modify the interception of the succeeding lines that get spoken. So this is all very complicated aspects of communication that we deal with. Wonderful. And it works. It usually works. We kind of understand each other.
Yes. Wonderful. Let me take another person we are studying. His name is Owen Barfield. He's a colleague of C.S. Lewis and a good friend of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. And are you familiar with his work by any chance?
I've heard of him, but not.
So, I would summarize his thought as what he's saying is that.
Did he write the Narnia series?
No, C.S. Lewis did.
Okay.
But C.S. Lewis, Barfield was the executor of the will of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis' first book is dedicated to Barfield. Barfield's first book is dedicated to C.S. Lewis. So there's a very close relationship between these three people, in the third being Tolkien. Now, Barfield is the linguist. He's the philologist. So all the deepest ideas about language come from him. And his formulation is that language has the power to produce a felt change of consciousness. He holds that what he focuses on the power of metaphors. So you're passing a metaphor of something that you can see in physical world, and in a way, in a dramatic way, so that it actually lights up the network in the other brain. And that is the power that language at its best have. So when is it like we experience this when we read poetry, for example, great poetry that we love, where just you will hear a sentence and it will just, you will have this aesthetic experience, cognitive experience of saying, wow, I see the world slightly differently now. So any thoughts about this kind of high-end power of language and poetry that can produce those effects?
Yeah, I love this question. Excellent. Because I mean, these are things that when I was younger, when I was in high school, I used to know, I went into philosophy because of these types of questions. So wonderful. So yeah, I mean, so there's so many things that tie into this question, this idea. So the conversation, the line, the poetry, the line of the poem that gets sent. It requires a familiarity between the creator and the listener, right? There has to be vocabulary, shared vocabulary. There has to be common dictionary, right? So not only vocabulary, but the meaning of words have many meanings, right? There are homophones. So if the poem, because the poem is spoken, right? So it's not, we don't know if when they say the word red, is it R-E-D or R-E-A-D, right? It's not clear. So you have to interpret. So the aspect of language comes into play, the aspect of connotations come into play, the aspect of context, the context of words within the sentence, and the sentence within other sentences, and all of those sentences within the present moment that they are staying in the moment, right? And the context of the world that they live in, right? Is it the 20th century, the 21st century, or the 17th century, right? These contexts. There are social dynamics. So right now, are we living in the middle of a war, right, where there's social upheaval, or is it is there a physical stress? So are we living in a world where there's environmental upheaval and climate change happening, right? Aesthetic. You use the word. I love that word. The aesthetics of the poetry of the mellifluousness of the words, how they tie together, how they evoke concepts that are other concepts separate from the word. These are all aspects to that line that exchanges. There may be aspects to the personal that the speaker or the author who wrote the poem, right? There are things in their lives that are happening that the listener may not be aware of, but that may come out through the poetry, right? What was her name? I forget her name, but young poet. She's the poetess on Biden's inauguration.
Amanda Gorman.
Yeah. I mean, wonderful. I mean, the poem that she read, we could see the personal experiences she's a young person. Now, the personal experiences she went through, and what it meant for her, freedom and America and liberty, all these concepts. So there's so many aspects to emotions and personal ideas that come out through poetry and through language, and they all come to play. Let me try to think of some other. These I would say would be I don't want to say trite, but these are the common trends that everybody's aware of. I suspect. So when we deal with poetry, there are so poetry also can be negative, right? Negative in the sense that negative space. So you give a bunch of words, but the idea being expressed is that word which is lacking among those words, right? That's an example. So, and that depends on whether the other person is sophisticated enough to understand that type of poetry, right? That the speaker is saying that they're giving them a message of negative space, of missingness. There may be ideas around, let's see. So some poems, what they do is they create scenes, right? They create an ambiance, right? An aesthetic. Other poems, what they do is they shock, right? They bring you out of the moment. They bring you out of the present moment that we share, that we're in. And they use vivid, strong words or some way to take you out of it and put you into a completely different place that the author wants you to be in. And then they play and it's a game. And it's intentional, but it's mutual. It's, the listener wants to because they're there willingly. But it's a way to take you to another place where you haven't been, or you either you've never been or you haven't been for a long time. But it's a way to change your mindset completely, to take you out of your present mindset, anything and everything about your mindset, and take you into. So, for example, they might take you inside of a black hole, right, where none of us have been. But through poetry, they can do that. So, many aspects to it that come to mind.
All right, so two more questions. The first one of these is, we've been studying Tao Te Ching, Gospel of John, and Bhagavad Gita in parallel. Tao Te Ching, Jason is doing translations from Mandarin for us. So we have some contact with Mandarin there. For Bhagavad Gita, Yogeshwar is doing translation from Sanskrit, so we have some contact with Sanskrit. Gospel of John, though it is English written at a different time. And that also works very differently than the modern English. So it's very interesting to notice how these different languages, the English, which is the alphabetical language, and you've got this Mandarin, which is very different, and Sanskrit, which is very different. So any thoughts about how these three different languages of three, great cultures, the West, China, and India, whether there is any difference in, what is the difference in the way in which they operate in our brain?
So we're going to go into some speculation because this is not. So with language across the board, all languages, all human languages, there still are similarities between all of them, right? Because as I said earlier, we all share some very, very fundamental basic experiences when we grow up. We all have a mother, we have to be born of a mother. Usually there's a father or father figure around. There is a small community or a large community, that's some type of community. We live on a physical planet, not in ocean. It might be near ocean, but we're not. Most of us are not living in the ocean, right? So there are many aspects to the world that give us commonality. And then the human side of the world is actually vast and complicated, but that gives a lot more that we don't realize the commonality between us. For example, the fact that all of us, so just even the physical aspects of humanness, that we all can move, we all talk and hear, listen, right? We can taste and et cetera. We have emotions, we can feel and hug and et cetera. So these are all physical aspects of our bodiness, of our humanness. Then the social aspects, we all have tussles, we have fights, we have affections, affectations, we have hostility, we have envy, we have competition. These emotions and these behaviors exist in pretty much every group of people. Then we have hierarchies, right? Every group of people have hierarchies. We have leaders, we have followers, we have people who want to become leaders, we have people who are become leaders and they're toppled, right? So there's these dynamics around relationships. So all of these aspects are parts of the languages that we have. And then there are aspects of the language also is, so I'm assuming you're talking about written, but I'm going to spoken, but I'm going to bring in written also, because these ancient texts were all written, and that's how they're maintained. That's how we still have them, although there's a strong oral tradition in the Asian ones that was very important. That's, there's a time period that they passed through that. So the oral and the written are both important aspects of language, that, especially this question, because the texts that went through the oral period, not written, there are certain aspects of our oral behaviors that imprinted on the way that those stories exist. And the parts that never went through that phase, those also imprint. So for example, the Gospel of John, from my understanding, it did have an oral phase also, because even the Bible had oral phases, but it was much less than the Tao Te Ching and the Gita. But so the time period, and also the the number of years, the number of centuries, as well as the number of people involved who were responsible, who had to be responsible to keep the stories intact and unchanged, and their memories. Another thing that's important here is that in the past, from what we know, in the past, memory and recollective memory was very, very good, very much better than we have today. People could remember long, long passages, learn it at a young age, and remember it into their upper years, into their senior years. And they can remember, I had an uncle who memorized many, many poems as a child, as a student, a college student. And in his 70s and 80s, he could recite them, 20 minutes of a poem, so it fascinated me, so all of these aspects of language come to play when we're talking about these three. Also, then the cultural aspects. So, for example, the Gospel of John, specifically the geographic area, today we might characterize it as desert-like. Although in the past, in at the time period, it's believed it was not as much a desert. There was much more greenery and flowing water, rivers, and things like that there. But the nomadic nature was there even then. It was sort of desert-like, the types of animals, and that affected the types of relationships. Because in a nomadic setting, the types of relationships and the length of time you can have relationships with people, and how strong the bonds would be, and the types of words you have to use to communicate. How do you engage somebody else you're telling a story with, right? The types of words you have to use to engage them and keep them. Because if they're busy in a desert where it's more important to find your meal because it's more difficult to find your meal, so you're not going to be as actively listening to the speaker, right? So the speaker has to use different types of words or different types of emotions to raise the flock, so to speak. So these are all aspects that come to play. I think those are probably things that explain why the languages are different, why some things are more ornate and flowery and others are less ornate and flowery, why some things are more philosophical and more existential, you might say, or more difficult to or multi-layered. In some of these texts, the ideas are multi-layered, whereas in others, they're very straight and down to earth and a direct message that they're trying to impart. I think those are the reasons, some of the reasons why.
Wonderful. I just love that you brought in the entire context in which the language develops as a way of understanding it. Beautiful. May I ask you one last question?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay. We're studying style of writing, style of speaking. There is this book called Clear and Simple as the Truth. A very, very interesting book. And it identifies multiple styles. It identifies the practical style where the person who knows how to do something is just explaining to somebody how to do it with little else. Then there is the plain style which holds that anybody can understand anything, even a child can understand anything. Then there is the subjective style or introspective style, which just is talking about almost a stream of consciousness, about what is going on in someone's consciousness. There is a romantic style, which says that you get these insights at some point and you're trying to express it. And there is the classic style, which is in the 17th century French style, Mark Twain, people like that. So it's really fascinating to see how these different styles of writing and speaking work within individuals. So any thoughts about these different styles of writing or speaking and how they operate on the brain?
So yeah, I like this question because it gets to what's the best way. Well, two things it gets to. One is that not every style works with everyone, right? And second, is it possible even, or what is the best way to determine the best style for the situation we're in, right? And one of the most challenging aspects is when you're speaking to audiences, large groups of people especially, because there's not one style. You can't rely on one style. You have to kind of come with a salad or a soup or a melting pot of styles. So I'm trying to think of. So you want me to just talk about the various types of styles, or what?
Any observations, or I can tell you the description of the classic style.
No, I understand. I'm familiar with many of those styles. So
wonderful.
So just So you want me to kind of tie my thoughts around them?
Sure,
Is that
please.
okay? Okay. So I think, yeah. I mean, so I mean, so personally, I believe in I don't remember the term that you used for it, but I believe that anybody, in a theoretical sense, anybody can understand anything. There is a limit, because if the brain that a person is born with has severe deficiency, then there are limits. But for most normal people, anybody can understand almost anything, but it requires time. It requires patience and explanation and depth, right? It requires time to understand. But if you have time, and if you have a patient teacher, then I think anybody can understand anything. And that fundamentally is what I've experienced and what I've seen in the world, is that anything, no matter how complicated, the most complicated things in the world can be explained to anyone. And I start from that point of view. So taking that point of view, the other ones to me are elaborations on that theory. This is a theory, my theory, but I think other people share it also. So I think the other aspects are elaborations of that. So, for example, and there you can add flavors to this basic technique or tenet of in the conversation, the first line that you give out, you look for visual clues as to, did the person get that first line, or to what extent, right? And using that, you modify your style a little bit, and you present the same idea maybe in a different way, or it might be a different idea, right? And then you look to see. And if the person asks a question, if they look perplexed, then you missed it. And you want to start over, but you want to do it in a different way. Or you might basically bring in a joke. You might be self-effacing it. I'm not doing a good job, am I? Right? This is not making sense to you. Let me try again. And then you try again. So I think this is the power of communication, because of good communicators. Because if you can do that, and it's easier on one-on-one or small groups, if you can do that, then there's a greater chance that the other person will understand what you're trying to say. But also, for me, the most challenging part is that this takes time, especially if the connection is not strong, or the connection is not mellifluous, is not romantic, is not very easy, is not very natural. If the people aren't familiar with ideas, the two people, one is or isn't, either one, the speaker or the listener, then it can be difficult to get. Or what can happen is the speaker is not experienced, and the listener is very experienced. But the listener asks a question which goes beyond what the speaker is. So the listener has to ask that question in a way that the speaker can understand. So it's not just one way, right? There's always a conversation going on, and the conversation isn't always verbal. But even when it's verbal, it can be for short periods of time. It can be more in the opposite direction, where the listener is asking questions. So I think style has to be modified, and you have to have more than one style in your repertoire to be effective.
Yeah, I mean, I want to look at all your answers, and I think one of the key concept here is that of context. You're trying to understand the context of the other person, and you have to realize what your context is and what that other person's context is. See what commonality exists that you can leverage, and see what the differences are, which you have to build up on. And if you correctly identify your own context and their own context, then your communication is better, because you know what to build on, what base you have, common base, and what you need to do in order to build on it.
Right. I would say the phrase "build up on," I would elaborate on that to say improve and make it better. So the conversation isn't over. So the conversation, because the point is that usually rarely are we communicating a single idea, right? It's an idea, and it's a get back and forth, and it's a complex set of things that we're discussing. So as the first initial idea, meets resistance, or isn't bounces around and doesn't quite reach, and as you get better, then as that idea connects, then the next idea becomes easier, because you've already started to narrow down, kind of. Although even that isn't always that well done, because sometimes you might think that the other person got it, but they actually got it. They actually understood a different variant of what you're trying to say. So you're misunderstanding. They're not understanding by misunderstanding the cues, the cues, right? But then, so you have to be. So the context is critical to this. But I would add another word, which is flexibility. So you have to be flexible with the notion that your idea did make it or didn't make it. You have to be flexible with the idea that the signals you're getting back are accurate or inaccurate, that you're misinterpreting them or interpreting them correctly. All of this vast dialogue, there's multiple people. When two people are talking, there are multiple conversations going on, right? And you have to be open to the idea that those multiple conversations, visual and oral and multiple levels of cognition, of theoretical, all of these simultaneous conversations, you have to be flexible in reassessing and reinterpreting what you took to mean and what you're trying to say.
Yeah, wonderful. I mean, I would add one thing which is implicit in everything you're saying, that communication is a conversation. So it's always two ways. There is no one way, because you need the feedback, continuous feedback, correction in order. All right, Sanjay, this is delightful as always. And Joe, thank you for doing the hosting. Really appreciate it. And
no problem.
Thank you, everybody. Really, this is fantastic. Next Wednesday, we're going to be looking at Owen Barfield in detail. If you missed the first meetup, please please watch that video. Phil is going to be here talking about Owen Barfield. And we're going to start this Sunday. We got 2 special meetups. We are starting with Faust. It's going to be introduction to Faust, so you don't have to read everything beforehand. We're going to just get started. Why look at Faust at 5 p.m. Eastern time. And then at 9 p.m. Eastern time, I'm going to give an introduction to this book called Clear and Simple as the Truth. And if you really like that style, classic style, and want to master it, we're going to be doing a series of workshops. They're going to be very serious workshops. This is something that we have never done before, kind of systematically trying to grok or make part of you a style, which is very hard to do actually. And it requires a lot of work. So this Sunday is your sampler to say, is this something worth looking at, worth doing? So hope you guys can make it. See you folks.
Thank you. Thank you, Shrikant. Thanks, Sanjay. Good night.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Shrikant.
Thanks, everyone.